In this series of presentations, we'll take a closer look at the history of the Hellenistic age, with a particular focus on the history of Judea during this period, which traditionally starts about 334, when Alexander the Great begins his eastward conquest, and ends in 63 BCE for Judea with the intervention of Rome in Judean politics in a decisive way that brings Judea under more or less direct Roman control. For this period, we have an abundance of literary sources. Some of these are familiar from the scriptures or para-scriptural literature. For example, Daniel 7 to 12 is the biblical text most concerned with the Hellenistic period from the exploits of Alexander against Persia. You may remember that vision of the ram and the he-goat going at it against one another, to the division of his empire among his generals and other successors, to the rise of one particular successor in that line, Antiochus IV, and his actions against Judea. Chapters 10 through 12 of Daniel provide an especially important witness to events during the reigns of Antiochus III and Antiochus IV, being written quite possibly, this is a matter of dispute of course, but quite possibly by a living contemporary of those events. The testimony of Daniel is greatly supplemented by two books that are in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox canon of Scripture, but relegated to Old Testament Apocrypha in the Protestant canon, and that is 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees, which of course focus on matters in Judea, but nevertheless therefore have to look beyond Judea to Seleucid and Ptolemaic politics, the involvement of two major dynastic descendants of Alexander's generals. These texts are very helpful for covering the period between 175 and 141 BCE, between the two of them. Greek and Latin historians give us the larger framework within which the events treated in these canonical and deuterocanonical sources fit. Of these, probably the most important are Polybius's histories, which give us a picture of the rise of the Roman Republic in the 3 centuries before Christ, and also the goings-on in all of the across the Mediterranean, because in its focus on the Roman Republic, inevitably Rome has dealings with Egypt and Syria and Asia Minor and Greece, so Polybius is a great resource for the history of this period throughout the Mediterranean. And also Appian wrote the Roman history, but he also wrote on the life of Alexander and his conquests. So Appian's collected works are a very important resource, as is Livy's history, which again details chiefly the rise of the Roman Empire from Republican times, and the historical library of Diodorus Siculus, Diodorus of Sicily. Historical library often known by its proper Latin name, Bibliotheca Historica. So these historians are excellent sources for the actions, particularly of Alexander and then the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires that rose up from two of Alexander's successors, as we'll cover. Josephus also provides an important resource for this time. He, of course, is particularly focused on events in Judea. In books 12 through 14 of his Antiquities, he gives us a good window into Hasmonean and early Herodian history, as also in the opening sections of his Jewish War. So with these sources informing us, as well as archaeology and the results of modern historians' reconstructions, we can begin our survey of this period And in this particular video, we'll focus on the history from Alexander the Great to Antiochus III, so between about 334 BC to 187 BC. We'll see at the end of the slides show if I'm actually correct with that latter date. Alexander, of course, is from Macedon, the son of Philip of Macedon, who really is credited with uniting Greece and Macedonia into a formidable power. But of course, the major power in that region at the time is the Persian Empire, which is shown here with its boundaries at its height. As the major contender to the east, of course, this is where Alexander wants to focus his attention and begin his eastward sweep around the Mediterranean to take away the empire from Persia and create a new Greco-Macedonian empire. Alexander is able to accomplish this chiefly in his battle against King Darius III, who, after putting up an attempt to keep Alexander out of Asia Minor and finding himself pushed back, ends up fleeing before Alexander's determined forces and is in fact assassinated by his own generals, perhaps for his weakness, his cowardness, his inability to preserve the glory of Persia in the face of this Macedonian invader. Before Alexander's death, and we have to marvel at his military achievement, he begins his conquests in about 334 BC and is dead by 323 BC, and in this mere 11 to 12 year period, he is able to lead the armies of Greece and Macedonia all the way around Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, securing that area for himself by about 331 BC, and then pressing further eastward until he captures Babylon itself and even pushes further through Parthia to the Indus River itself, the very boundaries of modern day India, uniting all of that into a single world empire. At this point, perhaps we could take a moment to think about how Alexander went about, after the military conquest is said and done, went about unifying these many conquered territories into a single imperial unit. One of the important components of this strategy was that he brought the model of a Greek city with him wherever he went. And so even during his lifetime, I believe, 40 capital cities or other major cities from the former indigenous empires were remade after the image, according to the polity, of a Greek constitution. And if you're interested in pursuing that more deeply, Alexander the Great's tutor, the philosopher Aristotle, wrote a work called the Athenian Constitution, which became the template for the reorganization of Greek cities across this vast empire. So with the transplanting of the concept of a Greek city, not only remaking but also founding new cities throughout this area, the administration of the entire empire happened within what quickly became a newly familiar mode of living together in a city, following this constitution. The local youths, the indigenous elite youths of the population, were enrolled as ephebes, based on a Greek word indicating that body of citizens or children of citizens that would be educated in Greek language, philosophy, culture, science, trained to become leaders in that Greek city. So through the education of the next generation, by enfranchising indigenous elites in these Greek cities and inviting them to participate, Alexander made it quite winsome for the local populations to adapt themselves to the Greek way of politics and to continue to enjoy local influence and even international influence as they became part of the life of these new Greek cities. Alexander also encouraged intermarriage between his Greek and Macedonian soldiers and the local people groups. And he, in fact, gave a model of this himself as he chose a princess of Bactria named Roxanne to be his own wife. His was not an exclusivist imperial policy, but a highly inclusivist, as long as we understand we're only talking about including pretty much elites, local elites wherever they are across the world, and wedding, in some cases literally, wedding them to his own power base, his military power base, and developing a one world empire through inclusion rather than through exclusion, and keeping the locals at bay in some second or third rate level. Alexander, and increasingly then his successors, had a cultural strategy as well. In this new world, Greek language was the universal language. Greek ideals, Greek literature, Greek drama, Greek music, Greek athletic practices and events infiltrated this entire region and began to unify the region by shared language, ideals, and even recreational practices. In the course of this, one would have to say it's not merely a matter that the world became Greek, because Greco-Macedonian culture was also changed during this time. Hellenization is not just making other peoples like the Hellenes, like the Greeks, but inevitably changed the Hellenes as well, as they became exposed to myriad new cultural ideas, religious traditions, philosophical traditions, arts and entertainments and what have you. So kind of a melting pot with preference being given to all things Greek, but not exclusively so. Alexander also had a strong religious policy for unification. He did not impose Greek gods on the world. He honored local religious cults and identified local gods and goddesses with Greek gods and goddesses, the effect of which being to say we can all worship our ancestral gods, and in doing so we are in fact worshiping one another's gods as well. Thus, if there's a chief god in a pantheon in Babylon, that chief god is identified with the chief god of the Greek pantheon. So Bel and Zeus can be identified with one another, or Horus and Apollo can be identified with one another. So there's a sense not really of religious competition, or a sense of having to protect one's own religious culture against the invader's culture, but a very savvy sense of expressing further an underlying unity that is presumed to have been there from the beginning. Through these strategies, Alexander and his successors are able to create a highly unified, not homogeneous by any stretch, but a unified empire. Of course, the short lifespan of Alexander sent this unified empire into turmoil after 323 BC. Alexander's son by Roxanne was still just a child and in no position to take over, and Alexander's generals, who had become accustomed to power and being seconds to Alexander, suddenly found themselves second to none, and in competition with one another to gain the greatest part that they could of Alexander's original empire. This resulted in decades of wars between the successors, known as the diadochoi, which is merely the Greek word for successors, with, by about 301, things panning out such that a general of Alexander named Ptolemy controlled Egypt and Libya, certain islands in the Mediterranean, and then a southern portion of Asia Minor, and that became his corner of Alexander's world. A general, not one of Alexander's generals directly, but actually a general of Ptolemy, named Seleucus, was able to take Syria and Babylon, and de facto, therefore, everything east of Babylon in Alexander's empire. Other successors entrenched themselves in, on the one hand, Thrace and Asia Minor, and on the last real hand, in Greece proper. Their fates are less important for us because our interest, looking ahead to Second Temple Judaism and the early Christian period, really focuses our attention on the activities then between Ptolemy and Seleucus and their successors. Here is probably a rather rough depiction of Ptolemy the First, the founder of this dynasty. This is a tetradrachm from Egypt, and Ptolemy adopted the eagle as, in effect, the symbol of his empire. Here is a bronze statue, probably a better likeness than you can find on a coin, of Seleucus, Ptolemy's general and eventually peer in terms of being a leader of a Hellenistic kingdom. Seleucus, who's known as Nicator, Seleucus the First, after there is a Seleucus the Second and Third and what have you. Their division of the territory basically left Palestine under Ptolemaic control, even though Seleucus was able to push Ptolemy almost entirely out of Asia Minor and the Greek Isles and the Mediterranean Isles, except for Cyprus. And Palestine would become a highly contended area then between these two giants for a century and a half to come. Seleucus left his empire to his son Antiochus I, under whom the boundaries didn't really change. Antiochus II, however, attempted to ally the two kingdoms, proposing a marriage to his peer Ptolemy II, known as Philadelphus, with Ptolemy's daughter Berenike being married to Antiochus II. This attempted alliance, however, ended up backfiring on the two of them, as Antiochus divorced Berenike to return to his first wife, Laodike, again, and Laodike ended up having Berenike and her son executed, just to make sure there was no rival to the Seleucid throne for Laodike's own child. This, of course, further alienates the two dynasties from one another. Berenike's brother, Ptolemy III, came to the throne of Egypt in about 246 BC, and he was bent on avenging his sister's and his nephew's execution at the hands of Laodike of the Seleucid line. And so he launched a campaign against the then Seleucid monarch Seleucus II, known as Callinicus. And Ptolemy III, in fact, drove Seleucus out of Syria and even out of the westernmost parts of Babylon, pushing the Seleucid Empire quite far back. And he returned to Egypt in triumph, even having recovered some of the Egyptian idols that had been carried off long before when the Persians invaded Egypt in 525 BC. This achievement is celebrated in a priestly inscription that can still be seen in a museum, the exact location of which now escapes me, called the Canopus Decree. It's also celebrated in Daniel 11, verses 7 to 8. Ptolemy III couldn't hold on to the newly acquired territory, however, and it seems that his real intent was simply to punish, not to colonize and extend his boundaries. So Seleucus II was able to recover his territory before he himself died. Now, during this period, Judea was largely allowed to govern itself, just under different overlords. So first it served under the Persian overlords, then under Alexander, whose rule whose rule Judea accepted peacefully, probably sending envoys to Alexander to acknowledge his rule. The coastlands fought against Alexander and suffered miserable defeat. Judea never tried, I guess feeling no particular loyalty to the Persian Empire. It didn't really matter what Gentiles were dominating them. They were all equally bad, equally unwelcome. So Alexander allowed Judea to continue to rule itself, and the Ptolemies, when Judea fell under the sway of Alexander's general, Ptolemy I, allowed Judea to continue to administer itself according to its ancestral law and its ancestral polity, meaning a high priest who had chief religious authority, and a governor, such as was appointed during the Persian period, who had more, if one could make this distinction, secular, or perhaps we should just say administrative responsibilities. At some point, however, early in the Greek period, the high priest was vested with both kinds of power. So for a time, the high priest enjoyed both supreme religious and supreme administrative rule over Judea, and that was an unprecedented spectrum of power for that figure in this area. Now, it was also a contended concentration of power. Many non-priestly families, who of course would never ascend within the Judean hierarchy of the priests because they simply had the wrong genealogy, coveted some kind of secular authority, which could be granted to them by the Gentile overlord. This particularly comes to the fore toward the end of the 3rd century BC, or the beginning of the 2nd century BC, when Onias II, the proper high priest and chief administrator of Judea, defaults on paying the tribute or the taxes that are due to Ptolemy, in this case Ptolemy III at the time. Because of this defaulting, it was possible for an enterprising layperson named Joseph ben Tobiah, Joseph the son of Tobias, to, in effect, gain an appointment from Ptolemy III, so that now power was divided again. The high priest was, of course, still allowed religious authority, but now a member of an entirely new and lay family was elevated to the chief administrative authority. And Joseph showed himself to be rather open to the Gentile world. He accommodated to a level that conservative Jews would no doubt have found problematic. For example, he will write to his Gentile associates and superiors, "Thanks be to your gods," which is quite a thing for a Jew to write. He would also be known for giving or selling Jewish slaves to Gentiles, which of course is forbidden by the Torah, and also leaving some slaves in his own household uncircumcised, which we know because of some records of the transfer of both circumcised and uncircumcised slaves from one of Joseph ben Tobiah's estates to that of one of his Gentile colleagues. So he was a bit lax with the law, and that probably helped him considerably to gain influence himself, but also to gain temporal advantages for Judea. He is in fact remembered by Josephus quite positively. He brought the Jews out of a state of poverty and lowliness to one that was more splendid. And this is a tension that becomes increasingly important then in Judea. To what extent, for the sake of bettering our situation politically and financially as a city or as families, to what extent do we maintain the strictures of the law of Moses? To what extent do we relax them so that our engagement with Gentiles can be more natural, easier, without all the speed bumps or, in some cases, roadblocks between our interaction with them that makes networking difficult, that in some cases makes us look more barbaric and less like appropriate partners and colleagues to our Gentile overlords and neighbors. This becomes an important set of questions that Jews wrestle with throughout this period and come to very different answers concerning, as we will see as we press on. Seleucus II had two sons who began their reign jointly, Seleucus III and Antiochus III, who comes to be known as the Great. And he indeed is one of the brightest and most energetic military rulers of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus attempts to take Palestine from Ptolemaic control round about 219 to 217 BC. Now, it should be said that Antiochus actually has the legitimate claim to Palestine. According to an agreement reached between all of Alexander's successors back in 301 BC, the Seleucids are supposed to be granted Palestine. Seleucus I did not press this claim against Ptolemy I, in part, no doubt, because Ptolemy had been a great supporter of Seleucus I in his own career. Seleucus had started out as Ptolemy's general, and it might just have seemed inappropriate for him to turn on someone who had formerly been his benefactor. Antiochus III, however, very much aware of the historic claim and with no special ties then to Ptolemy IV by this point, wants to see that claim finally realized for himself and his own dynasty. He is able to recover some of the coastal territories of Phoenicia for himself, but is unable to really take a foothold in Palestine because Ptolemy IV, at the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC, pushes him back. So Antiochus III instead focuses his energies on westward expansion into Asia Minor, and he's very successful. But here his ambition proves to be his downfall, because he is cut off from pushing too far west because of the presence and the interests of the Roman Republic, to which we shall return a little bit later. After about 20 years, he makes a second attempt at wresting Palestine from Ptolemaic control, and this time he is successful. In fact, he even receives support from Judea to this end. Perhaps the leaders down there saw that he would be successful anyway. Perhaps they were themselves looking forward to certain gains that could be had for Judea by throwing in their lot with Antiochus III. So after the Battle of Panium in 198 BCE, Egypt no longer has control of Palestine as a whole, Judea in particular. As a result of their alliance with Antiochus III, they are given all the rights that they had previously enjoyed, and this is formalized in a document that is preserved in Josephus's Antiquities and is generally regarded to be historical. These rights included the permission for Judeans to continue to govern themselves by their ancestral law, which means the law of Moses, the Torah, support from the royal treasury for the temple sacrificial cult, which is quite an offset for the religion of Judea, as well as a 3-year relief from tax and tribute, so that the land of Judea could recover fully and return to its former productivity, having been ravaged fairly seriously in the course of the wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, specifically between Antiochus III and whoever was on the throne in Egypt at the time of his 2 attempts to gain this territory. During this time, somewhat incidentally, Simon II is the high priest, and this is the high priest, the Simon who is praised by Yeshua ben Sira, author of the Wisdom of Ben Sira, which can be found in the Old Testament Apocrypha, or the Old Testament itself of our Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters. And it seems at this time that both administrative and religious power were vested in the high priest again, rather than divided between the high priest and the family of Joseph ben Tobiah. In fact, this might even have been one of the gains that Simon saw as a result of casting in his lot with Antiochus against Ptolemy, who was obviously the supporter, the appointer of Joseph ben Tobiah, and therefore no friend of Simon II if Simon wanted the fuller array of powers for himself. Oops. Antiochus III's story does not end with a bang, unfortunately for him. On this map, we see, of course, the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, but there's another power of great importance off to the left. To the west of these empires, the Roman Republic is a growing force in the Mediterranean. And it must be said that even while it was technically a republic, it was already an empire insofar as the republic controlled areas, territories, beyond Rome's indigenous area. Hence, already by 200 BC, They have taken control of some major Mediterranean islands, Sicily, Corsica, and the like, have a foothold in Macedonia, as well as in what is now Spain. As the 2nd century wears on, the Roman Republic is able to expand dramatically, taking over North Africa as a result of the famous defeat of Carthage, and increasingly extending its tendrils toward the east, where both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are also trying to expand their empires. Now Antiochus III, after he captures Palestine, decides to return to Asia Minor and continue his westward expansion. And at this point, he goes simply too far. He crosses from Asia Minor into Greece itself, trying to make part of that land part of his empire. And this is just far too close to Italy for Rome's comfort, so Rome turns its military forces against Antiochus's, defeating Antiochus both by sea and by land, and imposing upon him a treaty that includes financial terms that are ruinous for the Seleucid Empire. To that period, the largest, in effect, fine imposed as part of a treaty ever is imposed on Antiochus III. So for the rest of his life, and for the next successors' reigns, the Seleucids are largely concerned with holding on to their empire while raising enough money to keep Rome from assaulting them from the west. In effect, an ancient international version of protection money. So this is how Antiochus ends his career. In fact, in an attempt to get money, he raids a temple and is killed by the priests and worshippers in the process. He has 2 sons, Seleucus IV and Antiochus IV. We will come to them in our next segment, and it is Antiochus IV who will be of great importance and leave such a lasting remembrance upon the memory of the Jewish people that, in effect, all future portrayals of Antichrist in the end hearken back to Antiochus IV epiphanies. At this point, I would like to just give a little bit of attention to the Samaritans during this period. Because, of course, for example, in the ministry of Jesus, Samaritans are an important population for his own work and in the growth of the early church. The residents of Samaria and its environment had always regarded themselves, always being through the Persian periods and before, as the descendants of the northern tribes of Israel who faithfully worshipped at Mount Gerizim. The people of Judea, or Yehud, as the place was known during the Persian period, denied the Samaritans this genealogical claim. Instead, they regard the Samaritans as a mixed breed of religious syncretists. You could see, for example, how they're portrayed in 1 Kings 17, verses 24 to 31. So this is kind of an ideological war there. The Samaritans regard themselves as true Israelites. The Judeans insist that they're not. And it is difficult to know historically whose claim is truer. To what degree were the Samaritans truly intermarrying with non-Jewish people? To what degree is that merely the result of Judean anti-Samaritan propaganda? The Jerusalemites' rejection of the Samaritans' offer to help rebuild the Jerusalem temple during the Persian period, something you can read about in the first verses of Ezra 4, was a decisive rejection on the Judeans' part of any kinship between the two groups. The mutual rejection and hostility continues to show up during the intertestamental period. For example, the one time Yeshua ben Sira talks about the Samaritans, he talks about them in the context of his contempt for, quote, the foolish people that live in Shechem, in Ben Sira 50, verses 25 and 26. And even though it's getting a little bit ahead of our narrative here, in the Hasmonean period, the period of Judean independence from Gentile rule between about 141 BC and 63 BC, during that period there are some military incursions against Samaria by Hasmonean rulers. For example, John Hyrcanus I destroys Samaria and Shechem and tears down the Samaritans' temple on Mount Gerizim. So there's a great deal of hostility between these groups during this period. It should be said that at the beginning of the period of our interest in this presentation, when Alexander first made his sweep through what had been a Persian region, Sanballat III, the ruler of Samaria, welcomed Alexander and established good relations with Alexander, even being given permission by him and probably funding to build a temple on Mount Gerizim. But shortly after Sanballat's death, the Samaritans rebelled against Alexander, trying to establish independence, I suppose, for some reason. The worst thing they could have done for themselves, because it resulted in Alexander dispatching a general who destroyed Samaria completely and then rebuilt the city in Greek fashion, not for the Samaritans to occupy again, but for a settled colony of Macedonian veterans, veterans of the Macedonian army. So, in effect, decisively kicking the Samaritans out of that region. For this reason, the Samaritans resettled around Shechem instead of Samaria proper, and eventually rebuilt their temple on Mount Gerizim. In our next presentation, continuing this historical background lecture, we'll look at the events in Judea, particularly from 175 to 164 BC, a much shorter period, but in terms of impact on Judean consciousness, one of the most important periods in Judean history entirely until the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 AD.